Welcome to the What Matters Today podcast from the Geneva Graduate Institute. I'm Dan Graham, Head of Communications at the Institute. In this podcast series, we ask members of our faculty to comment on key global issues. In this episode, we explore the multifaceted challenges and strategies of one of the most influential nations on the global stage, China. We'll examine the evolving relationship between China and the United States, highlighting key moments and decisions that have impacted their interactions. Understanding these dynamics is crucial to grasping the broader implications for global politics and economics. My guest for this episode is Jan Francis Kiely, Senior Lecturer, International History and Politics here at the Geneva Graduate Institute. Jan is a historian of modern China, particularly interested in aspects of religion, social morality, law, justice, conflict, and its resolutions in the 20th century. He comes to the Institute from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, where he was professor and director of the Center for China Studies. So Jan, thank you very much for joining us on this episode of What Matters Today. My first question for you is, could you provide a brief overview of the political, economic, and geopolitical challenges China has faced in recent years?
Yeah, so thanks very much for having me, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here. That's a big question.
It is, I know.
How many hours do you want on this? I think people are pretty familiar with the, let's put it this way, it's a historic phenomenon of the relationship between the U.S. and China having begun or originated in the 1980s and 90s as something that was synergistic, growing together as part of a new globalization order in terms of political economy and so forth. But that came with tensions that were built in politically in a number of different ways already in that period. And it became much more seriously, strategically constrained, let's say, and tense from the mid-1990s, Taiwan Straits conflict and so forth, crisis. And that odd combination has continued.
Right.
So there has been a continuation into the Xi Jinping era that has come with this ongoing differentiation and divergence that can't be fully achieved economically, even under the current conditions, and that simultaneously has become much more competitive in the geopolitical, strategic, military range.
Right.
And that has intensified considerably. And China's challenges are partly as a result of that, but not solely. They're also about domestic politics, as are the U.S. side. So all of that comes together and produces the conditions of today.
And what was the state of U.S.-China relations before Donald Trump's election victory?
So there had already been this period of growing strain that I'm referring to. And that partly has to do with precisely this problem, which had extended in part due to things that Trump had done in his first term that some of the people that came along after were agreeing with. That there were certain ways in which dealing with the Chinese economy and particularly their export-focused efforts, electric cars and so forth, were of a concern to many different markets around the world. And so there were efforts to maintain some of the controls, some of the tariffs and so forth that were put in place. And there were also ongoing problems that were part of, and again, I don't know how much you want to talk about the domestic side of this, but there's a strong domestic side of this. Let's say that in that contrast that I just talked about, there were assumptions on both sides at the origins of that were not going to be realized. A lot of American policy people thought that eventually China would change. And I think a lot of people in Beijing were thinking, well, America would come to realize China needs to play a bigger part in the world.
Right. Yeah.
So both of those assumptions were built in. And increasingly, the fact that the other side didn't seem to understand either of those things were going to actually happen began to be seen as a very significant problem in their relationship.
Right.
And that has only gotten more intense up to recent times. So that gets played out in both the economic relationship and the geopolitical military side as well. Of course, the domestic politics of this all also have a lot more details of how things have changed in China that could be discussed. And of course, on the American side as well, particularly with things like Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan and so forth, the nature of changes in American domestic policy itself.
Yeah. And how did Chinese media cover Trump's initial decisions, and what were the public's reactions about this?
Well, Chinese official media is very much state media.
Right.
It has always been a form of state media under the People's Republic of China after a certain point. But prior to the Xi period, especially the more recent Xi period, there was maybe more leeway for different views to be shared. In this period, that is not so much the case. And so the direct view of a cautious approach to trying to deal with a complex case is going to be reflected in media. That's very different, however, from, say, social media, where people get to express more opinions.
Right.
And China is an extremely active sphere. And in that realm, there have been a number of ways that people can talk about these developments, not prior so much to Trump coming in, but after he came into power, that can detect something shifting more.
Okay. Thank you for that. And what strategy is China currently employing to respond to Donald Trump's policies, and what are the reasons behind it?
Well, I'm not really going to speak about their overall strategy. I think there are various detectable and consistent approaches in dealing with this particular situation for them. Like any complex major state, while maybe one voice is particularly strong now in the leadership, there are likely several positions detectable from the policy orientation. There's long-term policies that everybody agrees on. China wants to be a major economy, a big player in the world, a regional power, a global power. They've worked very hard to do this, becoming rich as a state, as a country, and powerful so they don't get pushed around is at the core of what Chinese nation state building was from the very beginning. And this is consistent to this point. But now I would say that, first of all, there is an interest. They certainly understand the opportunities that are produced by Trump. Right. They also understand the challenges.
Yep.
And they, in efforts they're making already, they're what they would consider, I think, a consistent position of placing themselves in the world as an alternative is substantially improved by the current events in the U.S.
Right. Right. And on that topic, how do you think China's role will evolve on the global stage moving forward?
Well, as a historian, I'll say I won't answer that question, Dan, and I'll leave. But, I think that anybody who underestimates China would be making a really big mistake, no matter how many difficulties they face now, which are a lot. Anybody watching the state of the Chinese economy now would be concerned about the choices that are being made, the closing down of the private sector, or the limiting the restraints on it, the restraint on innovation. Even when you see the development of something like DeepSeek, it's an outlier. It's a surprise. You've got major firms that have been once playing a very large place in the world that are no longer really doing so. Clearly, to anyone who's looking at this, there's fundamental issues also on the basic support of a lower level base economy, especially through various types of public goods that has been argued back to the early 21st century. It's very hard to convince people in Beijing to make those changes as something that would develop the economy. There's strong reasons we could go into the details of why that is the case. But last of all, of course, they recognize that a kind of autarkic model, which was sometimes talked about in the period of COVID, will not work. And they know this.
So obviously, Trump's been threatening China with tariffs. China responds back by saying, we'll be ready for any type of war, like tariff wars, but they also kind of hint any type of war. Now, there's never been a war versus China, US, except maybe the Korean War, where there was both sides were involved in that. But do you see this as a legitimate threat for that kind of war? Or do you think this is just going to be just tariffs moving forward, or Taiwan's going to play a key aspect in all of this?
The potential for conflict in this situation is real. Mm-hmm. Anybody who's been thinking about that, and this is not my area of expertise, but I'm familiar with the basics of it, There was a long period where the American military at some point helped build modernization of the PLA for a time. One of my graduate students here is working on this topic. The competition that has been developing since especially the 90s for a long time took for granted the overwhelming advantages of the U.S. military on its scale. That has been substantially reduced in recent time, and especially in the last 10 years. And at this point, regionally speaking, that produces all kinds of serious challenges. The typical wargaming of this on the U.S. side has demonstrated this is a little bigger challenge than they think. And it is probably inherently not strategically wise militarily to defend Taiwan. That's a whole other issue politically, but as a military phenomenon, that is a change on the outcome. Now, keep in mind, people are worried about the blustering of major leaders and so forth, which won't come out of China. Big decisions might be taken out of China, but not necessarily boastful and big moves on the global scale. I think one has to worry a bit more about the constant ways in which militaries are in close communication and interaction with each other and are unable to talk to each other effectively. I think most policymakers out there on both sides stay up at night on this one. There are people the age of our students out there right now on major ships, planes, and so forth. They have split seconds to make decisions. And this is going on constantly. This is like during the Cold War in that sense. And it's a problem that would arise like that would be much more serious.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jan. Thanks for joining us.
On that positive, delightful
note.
We'll probably survive the rest of the week.
Well, thank you. That's really interesting. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, of course. Anytime.
This podcast series is produced by the Geneva Graduate Institute communications team. For more information about the Institute, please visit our website at graduateinstitute.ch. I'm Dan Graham. Thanks for listening.